Good afternoon, everyone. Good day, and welcome to the Impossible State podcast at CSIS. My name is Victor Cha, Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair at CSIS, as well as Vice Dean and Professor at Georgetown University. And today, on the podcast, for our listeners, we'll be talking about sanctions and whether sanctions work or not. And we couldn't have two better experts to discuss this than the two we have here with us today, Anthony Ruggiero and Soo Kim. So let me begin the podcast by first properly introducing our two honored guests. So I'll start with Soo. Soo Kim is a Policy Practice Area Lead, or PAL, at the Logistics Management Institute, where she oversees LMI strategy for the practice area, including business development and policy innovation. For many of our listeners, you will probably know Soo more from her previous role, which was as a policy analyst at the RAND Corporation working on national security issues in the Indo-Pacific. And she began her career as a Korea political and leadership analyst at that organization over there in Langley, Virginia. And of course, also our good friend joining us, Anthony Ruggiero, who is Senior Director of the Foundation for Defense, is that right? The FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD's Non-Proliferation and Biodefense Program, as well as a Senior Fellow at FDD. Anthony has also spent quite a bit of time in the U.S. government and left the U.S. government as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs on the National Security Council as Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense. And of course, Anthony and I also spent a good bit of time together doing the six-party talks in the mid-2000s, and we both have the scars to show for it. So, but anyway, thanks for both of you joining us today. I see we have a nice prop now. We have an old radio. That's our latest prop for those of you who are watching the podcast live. But today's discussion is about sanctions in North Korea. And I want to start with you, Anthony. Anthony, you've been one of the most prolific writers on this question of the application of sanctions to North Korea, economic sanctions, financial sanctions, listings, things of this nature. And I couldn't think of somebody other than the two of you who are more expert on this. But maybe you could start us off by talking a little bit about the history of sanctions when it comes to North Korea, and then what your latest views are on it.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here at CSIS. Great to be with you and to talk about this important subject. You know, when I left government again, in 2021, I've been talking about what I call the robust North Korea sanctions myth, because I think there's a view out there that North Korea policy has failed, and the policy that has failed is a sanctions policy. And when in reality, except for 3 years since 2005, we have actually not had a robust sanctions policy on North Korea. And that means a couple of things. First, quantitatively, whether we are putting new designations in place, whether qualitatively, whether we're targeting the right kinds of activities, and then whether we are sustaining that. Because as all three of us know, we sanction North Korea, and then North Korea finds another way to do the same activity. And so what we have to see, or we should see, is a sustained new numbers on new numbers of sanctions targeting the right kinds of areas. And I'm sure we'll talk more about what I think those are. I mean, the preview is we should be targeting their revenue, and we're not doing that now. And when you dig into recent sanctions, they're woefully inadequate for the threat that we face today.
Great, thanks. And you also, there's a graphic that you wanted to show us about this. Maybe we could pull that up.
Sure.
So maybe you could talk us through the graphic.
Sure. In the one of the slides that I've presented here, basically what I've done is I've gone back to 2005, which is where most of us believe targeted financial sanctions, which is what we used to call them, started. That's when George W. Bush, who you served in the White House, that's when he signed Executive Order 13382, which is a global counterproliferation executive order. It's been used for Syria, North Korea, Iran. It's been used for other activities. And what you see here is plotted new designations over between present and 2005, 429 total. And in the circle area, you see 3 years. The last year of Obama, 2016, when President Obama told then President-elect Trump that, according to press reports, that North Korea would be one of his top priorities. And then the first 2 years of President Trump, right before summit diplomacy began with Kim Jong-un. And then on the right side of the graphic, you see both the second 2 years of Trump and the first 2 years of Biden. And in that circle, 62.7% of all North Korea sanctions occurred within that circle. And then in the next slide, it just shows graphically where, the orange line, the one on the bottom there, is still that same graph that you just saw, but just a cumulative sum where it just really represents that sharp increase is those 3 years. And then on the left, you just see sort of this steady incline, and then on the right, you see a steady incline and not that sharp one.
So maybe just for our listeners and our viewers, you could just explain, since we're talking about from this 2005 period forward, what were different about these sanctions at this time from like the Trading with the Enemy Act and all these other sanctions that have been on North Korea since the Korean War.
Right, and I should have said these are generally Treasury blocking sanctions, which are the ones that most people focus on. There are other types of sanctions, financial sanctions. You mentioned the Trading with the Enemy Act sanctions. There are many sanctions that we've imposed on North Korea, but then we've removed them in the circumstance of diplomacy. What you really see when you dig into 2016, 2017, and 2018, we pierced the other myth, which is that we cannot go after China. And what we saw in those 3 years, that the United States, again, a Democratic president and a Republican president, two people who could be not more opposite than each other, going after Chinese banks, Chinese companies, Chinese individuals. And what you see is that really only occurs within those 3 years. So that's really the qualitative analysis. And then when you bring it to the present, I would just say, like, if you look at the designation that happened last week from Treasury, which was the first one since December 1st, they targeted 2 individuals inside of North Korea, but then they targeted a network that it's not even clear that was an active network, since it was identified 2 years ago, and the bank account associated with it, this is according to the UN panel of experts, was closed in September 2020. So we're not even going after things apparently that are active. So that gets to the point of, we're not even doing the numbers, but then when we do it, we're not even doing the things that can be impactful.
Okay. Now, I think we want to also dig into why we're not doing these things. But let me go to Sue now and ask Sue that. So we've heard from Anthony about the types of sanctions, the ebbs and flows in the sanctioning that has happened historically over time. And I wanted to start with you, Sue, and ask you sort of to step back and ask the bigger policy question of whether, like, what are these sanctions for? And then how do we measure whether they work or not?
So I'll have to say that I do agree with Anthony's statements about where administrations have been with respect to the sanctions. In terms of the utility, I think that there are practical elements to sanctions, and we're trying to stop North Korean behavior. We're also trying to target the behaviors and activities of third-party countries like China and Russia, so that North Korea's aiders and abettors are also put to a halt. Going to looking at where we are in terms of sanctions and the debate that we have about the utility, I think what's missing is that sanctions, one, are not to be judged solely by themselves. They have to be applied within a broader spectrum of diplomatic, economic, military, and even these symbolic political gestures. That's where the utility, I think, of sanctions should be measured. The other aspect of sanctions is that I think the perception that we have about sanctions is that it's hurting the North Korean people, when in fact the intended purpose of sanctions is to go after the North Korean elites and to put or to send a message to the North Korean leadership that the behaviors are being watched and that there are consequences. So the idea that these sanctions are trickling down to the bottom rungs of North Korean society, I think there's a fallacy there, and I think that that's a trap that we fall into because it's an easy argument to make that the United States is basically targeting the poor North Korean people, when in fact that is not really our intent. Our intent is to stop North Korean leadership behavior and the leadership's penchant for provocations and the weapons, the buildup of Kim's nuclear arsenal. That's what we're trying to go after, but I think the debate that we see within the policy circles and also I think just where we are politically today is that sanctions seem to have this implied, misperception, I would say, that it's hurting the wrong people, and that the intended impact of sanctions is to go after the common folk, which we clearly know that that's not the intent.
Okay, I have a follow-up question on that last point, but before I do, sanctions clearly, as you said, aim to sort of shape North Korean behavior, right? The sanctions are what we call a form of compellence, right? They impose a cost on the target state, and you just keep hitting them with that cost until they change their behavior. But in your mind, do sanctions serve a purpose aside from trying to shape non-proliferation behavior? Do they serve a purpose in terms of negotiations?
Mm-hmm.
You said as part of a tool in a broader toolkit, like, or are sanctions largely to try to collapse the regime? I'm sure there's some who advocate sanctions for that purpose. Just what are your thoughts on these questions?
So dealing with North Korea, I think, involves a mixture of punishments or ways to provoke the North Korean regime to bring them to the table. Now, when it comes to negotiations, I think we also have to think about what it is we're trying to negotiate. Are we trying to basically limit the size of the nuclear capabilities, or are we trying to aim for denuclearization? And if there's no prick or if there's no pinch that Kim Jong-un feels, then he's not going to want to think about other options. At this point, I don't think we've shown enough, I don't want to use the word force, but I do think that we haven't been able to demonstrate the extent of our capabilities in terms of deterring North Korea, or Kim Jong-un rather, his penchant for provocations, his penchant for wanting to build up his nuclear weapons program. So when it comes to negotiations, the first thing I think we need to think about is what we're trying to go after. Is it really just, for diplomacy's sake, or are we trying to really bring about change to North Korean society where we do see the leadership being affected by our decision making? I don't think we're there yet at this point, and that, to me, as someone who watches North Korea, that is the most alarming aspect of policy, is that we're not really attacking the heart of the matter. And it could be because it's not just North Korea that we're dealing with right now, it's China, it's Russia, and other countries, and COVID, and the economy. So there are different buttons that when you push one, the other buttons kind of, go helter-skelter. So there requires, I think, a balance in the way we approach the North Korean problem. But while we're trying to find that sweet balance between carrots and sticks, I think we've shown that we don't have enough sticks, or we're not willing actually to use enough sticks to bring Kim Jong-un to the negotiating table, not for his benefit, but to really see a quantitative and a qualitative decrease in his program.
Okay. And then on this question, in your initial intervention, you mentioned this popular perception that sanctions hurt the North Korean people, but that's clearly not the intent of them, right? They go after elites, they go after human rights violations, they go after non-proliferation behavior. But, and playing devil's advocate for both of you, I mean, there is the argument that the sanctions, particularly we saw in 2016, 2017, rolled out by the UN Security Council, which were much broader general trade sanctions, were in a sense quite different from the sanctions we saw up until that point. And in fact, when Kim Jong-un met Trump in Vietnam, in Hanoi, we later learned that those were the sanctions that, I don't know, Anthony, if you were probably in government at that time, so I don't know how much you can talk about this, but you can at least talk about what you read in the newspaper. But those were the sanctions that we learned later, when Choi Sun-hee and the foreign minister came out, were the ones they want lifted. So would you consider those to be ones that are hurting the public? And I'd love both of your views on this, so.
So, for me, there's a gap in understanding what it is that Kim Jong-un actually was trying to articulate when he was saying that the sanctions were, or when the North Korean government wanted those sanctions removed, because he's still proliferating, he's still developing. So the thing is, I don't think we've reached a point where we've communicated enough to Kim Jong-un that, you know, if you do A, we'll do B, and B is actually going to either deter or discourage you from doing A again. That wasn't really there, and I also think that if the sanctions were really pinching Kim Jong-un, if the sanctions were really pinching the North Korean elites, we would have felt some kind of a squeak from the regime, and we haven't. So part of me thinks that it was also a part of North Korea's, you know, diplomatic, symbolic gesturing, I would say, where Kim Jong-un was looking for any way to get U.S. buy-in to the idea that Kim Jong-un was really willing to negotiate for a denuclearization agreement. But again, I think, thankfully, after the second round of negotiations, it came to a halt. Negotiations came to a halt, but we're still seeing North Korea make headlines. We're still seeing ICBM testings. We're still seeing the big question whether or not North Korea is going to conduct its seventh nuclear test. So that would be my answer.
Yeah. Anthony, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say the Kim family is not an innocent bystander here, right? They're making decisions about where they spend North Korea's revenue. You know, we know even now, even with sanctions not being well implemented, that North Korea is making hundreds of millions of dollars just from sanctions evasion alone. If they truly wanted to improve the circumstance of the North Korean people, they could spend that money on the North Korean people. They could stop selling you know, fishing areas where protein can be fished that could be used for the North Korean people. And there are on and on examples. Instead, Kim stands in front of missiles and does missile tests and continues his prohibited nuclear missile programs, money for the elites, money for the military. So to me, whenever I always hear that argument, I say, you know, the Kim family is not an innocent bystander. I'll also point out that in circumstances, in this particular circumstance and in other circumstances where we've tried the so-called white channel to, you know, provide a channel that is allowed for financial transactions, in the case of North Korea, that's usually abused. So that becomes a challenge there. Really the only way, in my mind, to improve the circumstances of the North Korean people is more either the regime has to change or its approach has to change in some way.
Yeah, I read somewhere that they estimated the cost of all the missile testing they did in 2022, and it was something like $200 or $300 million, and that obviously could have been national resources that might have been used in other ways, right? Earlier, Anthony, you mentioned China and the sanctioning against some of the sanctioning against China, and early on when we started these sort of smart sanctions, financial sanctions, I think they were called defensive measures at the time. Mm-hmm. Sort of the idea of like sanctioning China was kind of the third rail. Like everybody was very careful about that, but that seems to be less the case now. And I guess I have two questions for both of you. Like, what's been the Chinese reaction, and has that had broader implications for financial markets or for anything else? I remember back in the mid-2000s, everybody was worried that, oh, this could have major effects on the stock markets around the world and everything if we started sanctioning Chinese banks and companies, but that doesn't seem to be the case, right?
Well, that's right. In 2005, and you remember this clearly, Victor, we went after a bank in Macau, Banco Delta Asia. You know, that's a complicated story. That was more about the bank itself and North Korea getting caught up in that. But what we saw in that time period, 2016, 2017, and 2018, is we heard those same arguments. This is the third rail. It'll impact the global economy. But in fact, the reverse happened. China started implementing the sanctions they actually voted for. They started cracking down on that because the simple fact is that we gave them a choice. The U.S. gave them a choice. Again, a Democratic administration and a Republican administration, same choice. You can either work with North Korea and not have access to the U.S. financial system, or you can have access to the U.S. financial system. And of course, China chose to work with the United States. Now, when you fast forward to today, and you look in November and December, the Treasury Department went after representatives in China of Air Koryo, their national flag carrier, but they didn't go after the networks inside of China. In fact, one of the press releases said that one of the individuals was working with a Chinese company, and that company was not named, it was not sanctioned, and clearly they were working with other Chinese companies. So I don't know whether it's because they're sort of self-deterring in terms of going after China, but what we're not doing now, and really haven't since 2018, is going after the source of that. I'll also say that this administration, the Biden administration, last year said that 20 to 100,000 North Korean overseas laborers, which are prohibited by UN resolution, should have been stopped in December 2019, are in China currently, whatever that range is. I know it's a very wide range, but they also said that the regime gets hundreds of millions of dollars annually just from that practice. And so when you tag that with the estimate you gave, that is China violating the UN sanctions that they themselves voted for.
Okay. And Sue, I mean, I'd love to hear your views on the China question, but then I'd also like to add to that the whole question of COVID, right? I mean, North Korea has been under COVID lockdown now since January of 2020, arguably the harshest sanctions ever on North Korea. And yet we don't really see a change in behavior. If anything, their behavior has gotten worse. So I guess that's it. The first question is any additional thoughts on China, and the second, and Anthony also, I'd love to hear your views on this. Do sanctions really work if if North Korea has been locked down for 3 years under COVID?
So the issue with China, I think, as Anthony mentioned, I think this was what he was alluding to, is that there are, primary, secondary, maybe even tertiary steps that we need to take in terms of sanctioning China. And we seem to have scratched the surface when it comes to enforcing sanctions on these third-party countries and third-party entities. That is where I think the hiccup is. And in this current geopolitical backdrop where U.S.-China competition seems to be, it's intensifying, but it's also morphing into this, what kind of competition is this? It's not just economics. It's a competition or struggle for, I think, ideology and a rules-based order versus that other alternative. So it's becoming much more complicated. And I think because it's becoming much more complicated, there's maybe even greater hesitation to enforce something on China. And that's because the United States economy is also intertwined with the Chinese companies and Chinese businesses. So that's where we are with China. In terms of COVID and whether or not these sanctions are actually working on North Korea, I still maintain the position that we have not really seen a robust, all-around network of sanctions enforced on North Korea, on China, on Russia, and other countries that are complicit. Kim, I think that even if he feels the pinch of sanctions, he's still going to go after weaponization because that's the way for him to survive. And we've seen also, those images of Kim Jong-un with his daughter, and there's perceptions that she might be the successor. We don't know that, I think. But the fact that he's still doing what he does, we have to be careful here because I think that's what people see, and they say that sanctions don't work. But I think so long as he's not personally feeling that pinch, and so long as there's no real qualitative and all-around impact on his weapons ambitions, he's unstoppable. And the fact that we have countries like China and also Russia willing to sort of play with North Korea and to form alliances is also going to make Kim become more emboldened. And it also, I think, justifies his pursuit of weapons. He's also seeing the example of Putin and his invasion of Ukraine, and he's seeing that I can't live without nuclear weapons, and it's very it's helpful for me to have. And where we see rising tensions with the United States and countries like China and Russia, there's going to be more of a demand, I think, within Kim Jong-un to preserve, and I think to also raise the value of his weapons program.
I want to go to Anthony on the COVID lockdown question, but before I do that, you talked about the daughter, Jue. What do you think is going on there?
Oh. That's a good question, because I think from a instinctive nature, we tend to just glam onto whatever is shiny and new. And she's shiny, she's new, she's young, she's the 4th generation Kim. So there's been a lot of hype, I think, when it comes to assessing what she is and what value she holds. And it's not that we should not be, giving our attention to North Korean leadership, but there's this other really important thing called the nuclear weapons program that allows Kim Jong-un to be who he is, and that allows the Kim Jong-un family to be who they are. That's really important too, and I think, we have to be able to sort of, one, keep ourselves from being distracted by those shiny objects, while also realizing that there might be maybe other intentions beyond just leadership and succession that North Korea is trying to use for whatever domestic or external circumstances that Kim Jong-un is facing. So there's always, it's not just a two-sided coin, but I think it's like a helix where there's multiple sides of this, and we can't just rule out one because it doesn't seem to make sense. So as an analyst, I think we have to be careful in how we interpret North Korean behavior, and what we see in the public is not everything to it. There might be other factors and situations at play that we're not really privy to. But again, that's also not to say that we should completely dismiss the idea of something going on behind the scenes in the Kim family. So I think, in short, it requires us to be very flexible in our thinking, because certain assumptions that we hold about the regime in the 3rd generation Kim leadership might not be, a continuity that we saw from Kim 1 and Kim 2 and now Kim 3.
Yeah. North Korean palace politics, about as black a box as you can imagine. Okay. So, Anthony, I also want to go to you on this question of the COVID lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as somebody, whose expertise is sanctions, I mean, what do you think about this lockdown? I mean, if anybody had asked me in January 2020, how long can they last completely locked down like this, I would have said, like, at most 6 months. But here we are 3 years later. And what does that mean for sanctions? So,
Well, much of the sanctions evasion, though, is happening outside of North Korea, right? So we already have the overseas laborers, we have the vessels either exporting coal, which is a violation of UN sanctions, or importing petroleum. We have other, cyber-related sanctions activities. Those are all happening outside of North Korea. So those probably are happening unaffected. I think the core question is, these are strategic programs. Helping the military and helping the elites are also strategic priorities. I would imagine that those things are going to get into North Korea, whether they have to sit somewhere for a period of time so that they're not infected with COVID or whatever North Korea believes. But to me, I think the program is continuing with very little disruption. And going back to something that Sue said, to me, the bumper sticker is we have to disrupt the status quo. That Kim is very comfortable now. This is, and I don't know, we'll talk about it later, but this is why he feels like he can get into the Ukraine war in some way. This is why he can do, have a year where it's the most ballistic missile test ever. It's a little surprising he didn't do a nuclear test, but I'm sure there's some plan out there of when he's going to surprise us with that. For right now, he's pretty comfortable, and back to our conversation about the North Korean people, they certainly are not comfortable, but him and the elites and his family certainly are, and the sanctions are not the thing that's disrupting him and making him think twice about the things he wants to do, unfortunately.
So if you were back in the White House working on these sorts of issues, like, so what would be on the list? What would be some of the things that you can talk about? What would be some of the things that you would want to see more of? And if you can't be specific, just give us sort of general ideas.
No, I mean, I think we can be very specific. To me, I'm glad that there are others here on what I like to call denuclearization island, because, there are a lot of people who want to push that away even as the long-term goal. I think that still can be the long-term goal, but what it starts with now is diplomatic pressure that we're not doing a very good job of. In 2022, we had, the Security Council didn't really have any statements or any kind of condemnation of North Korea's activity. That's a disappointment, and I think this administration could do more on the diplomatic side. I give them credit on the military pressure side. They're doing a lot of good things there. They're reversing the pause or the halt in the USROK elections. But when it comes to economic pressure, to me, it's very simple. Target the revenue. And the way you can do that is, as I noted, hundreds of millions of dollars from overseas laborers. They're making money from the export of coal. And there's the cyber area, which again, the sanctions may not be the best tool for that. That may be more classic, know your customer, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, where you're going to have to bring in not just North Korea sanctions experts, but cyber experts, but then also experts from the Treasury Department to talk through, like, how do you address banks? Because the money has to, make its way out into the regular financial system at some point. That's probably going to be and they're making a lot of money, North Korea is, from those activities. That's probably going to be the point. So to me, if we could just start squeezing that pressure, the revenue, and have it go from a large amount to even a much smaller one, it'll force Kim to make these decisions that he'll be uncomfortable with, and then we'll have, as I noted, we can impact the Ukraine war even in a small way. We can do that, and then we can have China realizing that they have to help us in this rather than us having to go after large Chinese banks, which I think most people are unlikely to do. We're probably going after smaller Chinese banks will be the deterrence message that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned in that last intervention that there hasn't been much action in the UN Security Council at all. In large part, that's because China and Russia have not been cooperative, despite signing on to previous resolutions, and not even willing to enforce the resolutions, the prior resolutions that they signed on to when North Korea's carried out testing. Sue, I wonder your thoughts on sort of Russia and sort of their role in sanctions evasion with North Korea, and how much of a facilitating factor are they these days?
I don't think they're facilitating anything at all. I mean, they're so preoccupied with the war, and for Russia to jump on the U.S. bandwagon at this point is basically undoing the steps that Putin took to be where he is right now. In the past, I would think that this applies both to Russia and to China, but they were on board with it because there was some utility they derived by being on board with the sanctions. Now that we're seeing, again, toughening, competition with Washington and Beijing, Russia preoccupied with invading Ukraine, there's even less incentive, I would say, for China and also for Russia to pause what they're doing and to say, I'm going to help this U.S. effort to, tighten the chokehold on Kim Jong-un, because how does that help Putin ultimately? If anything, I think Russia and North Korea are finding a sweet spot of symbiotic relationship where both countries are isolated. Both countries are looking for friends to put on their list. And what better time right now when there's some confusion geopolitically, and not just in terms of security, but the economic downturn is also something that is motivating, I think, political decisions. So for Russia, I don't really foresee Putin in his own, voluntarily saying, you know what, I realize that what I did was wrong, and I'm going to turn now to the United States and help the United States sanction North Korea, because there's no value to that. And even if the North Korean assistance militarily to Russia is not a significant number, or in terms of changing that calculus, at this point, I think both sides are quite desperate to get help, and any help that either one can get, I think, is to them in that short-term view is probably going to be much better than surrendering and admitting that they were wrong and saying that they're going to actually do a 180 and maybe follow the rules-based order and see the benefits and the actual value of turning around and actually making things, doing things the right way, I would say.
Interesting. So I do want to sort of talk a little bit more about the Russia and North Korea piece in our last segment. And first, for not so much for our listeners, unfortunately, but for our viewers, I want to show you a graph that we put together that looked at the approximate count of rail cars that we've observed at the Kasang-Tumangang railroad crossing between Russia and China. Russia and North Korea. So again, for those of you who are able to watch this online, so that if we look at this date here, it's November. Sorry, if we look at this date here, this is November of 2022, where we see this massive increase in the number of rail cars along the Russian-North Korea border. So I guess the one question I'd like to ask all of you is, like, what do you think that is? I mean, we see this huge increase, and what do you think is going on here? Anthony?
Well, I think we heard from the White House, right, in January that November 2022 was right around when those transfers started happening. I think it was mid-November was the date that Admiral Kirby gave, right? We're seeing some kind of increase. Back to your question about COVID lockdowns, there's probably weapons going one way. It wouldn't surprise me if there are other things that North Korea needs going the other way, whether as a payment or as a way to evade the sanctions.
Yeah. So if we go to the next picture, I wanted to show you. So this was the photo that was released by the White House. That is dated. The photo was dated. The satellite imagery was dated November 18th, 2022, and so we can't see what's in these rail cars. We just have to take their word for it. They probably have other means of doing this, but this looks like these were weapon shipments that were going from the North Korea to the Wagner Group was view. And so what we did see after that, if we go to the next slide, what we see after this is actually let me see if I can make this work. This is what I wanted to show. What we see here is a real growth in the number of ore cars that are moving now between Russia and North Korea. That presumably has something to do with this trend. This is, again, about a month after Kirby's photos that give us some idea of sort of the volume of traffic that is happening between Russia and North Korea these days. So it could be coincidence, but probably not. Sue, what do you think?
I don't think it's coincidence at all. It just shows, the robust activity, and I shouldn't be surprised by this, but it's just baffling to see that despite the sanctions, despite the criticism and the scrutiny that we've shown on North Korea and Russia, the activity still continues. So that, to me, I'm drawing a blank or a question as to where policy is right now and what we're actually doing to stop those behaviors. But the utility of policy and actions aside, there's also this symbolic component that we can't dismiss. And I think symbolically, Anthony alluded to this as well, Kim is at a very comfortable position right now where he's used to provoking and not really getting any kind of punishment. He's used to getting rewards, and he's also now at a point where he knows that we've, wittingly or not, we've sort of acknowledged the existence of North Korean nuclear weapons. We've not formally acknowledged North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, but I think we're almost there. We're not doing anything about it. And that, the images that you've shown, I think that is one component of this comfort level that Kim Jong-un is in right now. And it's not just Kim anymore. It's his, it's his posse of friends in China and Russia that are also feeling comfortable. So that, I think, creates more homework assignments, I think, for policy analysts and also for the government to try to find a solution. And it's not going to take overnight, but there's a lot of factors that need to be considered, I'm sure. But this is one area where Kim Jong-un finds opportunities to poke holes, and there's opportunities to undermine some of our capabilities. And with COVID, with the economic downturn, and the change in administration, I think, from Trump to Biden was also a point or a gap where Kim may have been expecting something under the Trump administration. With a Democratic administration that we've said that we're open to negotiations with, or dialogue, let's say, with Kim Jong-un, and we haven't really shown that side. I don't know if we need to show that willingness. I think the comments that we've issued that we are open to dialogue should be enough, because Kim knows pretty much where the United States stands. But at the same time, the responses that we've seen, and Anthony mentioned that we've shown militarily a step up with greater coordination between Washington and Seoul. That's great, but at the same time, what else are we doing to show that it's not just like an unbalanced, unequally yoked kind of a policy approach, but we need to show that there are other tools that we can play so that Kim is not feeling as comfortable as he is right now.
Anthony, do you think that they're even interested in talking to us anymore? That they being the North Koreans? I mean, in the past, part of the argument for sanctions, part of it was compellence, right? Impose a cost for bad behavior to make them change their behavior. But, I think many would agree in the broader U.S. government and around the region that the other purpose of sanctions, at least the talking point was, we're not trying to collapse the regime, we're trying to put pressure on them to come back to the negotiating table. Is that even like a credible argument anymore these days?
Well, before we jump on that, just on Russia, I want to point out that this is we're 4 months after this started, and 6 weeks after Kirby talked about this, and we still haven't had a single sanction on North Korea for this activity.
Yep.
So I think we have to be very clear about that. And to me, I always say this is the lowest of low-hanging fruit. Like, they don't have to go directly at the North Korea-Russia relationship. They can start hurting North Korea's revenue streams to make Kim uncomfortable, and we haven't even done that. And so, for those who want to talk about North Korea sanctions or think about North Korea sanctions, that's the clearest indicator that we're in a bad space there. I defer to others who are true North Korea experts in terms of leadership, but Kim is comfortable now. To me, in 2018, he was very uncomfortable. As you noted, one of the clear things he asked for was sanctions relief. We're nowhere near that. Now, maybe I'll be surprised, and Biden tomorrow will, call Secretary Yellen and Secretary Blinken and say, let's unleash them, unleash whatever you've got on North Korea, and we'll get back to this, both numbers and quality of sanctions. But we're nowhere near that, and I just don't see North Korea coming back to the negotiations for what purpose. I mean, even those out there who I don't agree with, who want to do arms control negotiations, what from the North Korea side, what is the reason that they would do that now? The reason they would do that in the future, if there's some kind of pressure on them, which would have to be economic pressure, because the military pressure alone is not getting there, and diplomatic pressure alone, as you said earlier, it's got to be all of them together. I mean, as we all know at this table, the biggest flaw in the U.S. North Korea policy is that we always pursue one element of our policy. We never we should have a toolbox here. We never open the toolbox and look at every different element that we can work together. we've just never really gotten to that point. Maybe in those 3 years, 2016, 2017, 2018, but it's never been where we've been able to play each of them off of each other.
Yeah. Sue, anything you want to add to that?
I think I'm completely on board with what you're saying, especially the fact that, it's a complete toolkit that we need to consider. I guess when we pursue, let's say, sanctions, or we pursue just that diplomatic track, the fact that we've been dealing with the North Korean problem for such a long time, I think leads, one, to fatigue, but also there's this sense of urgency to solve the North Korean problem maybe. And from Kim's perch, it's not, I don't think that's the way he looks at it. He has more of a, not an easygoing, but more of a relaxed, long-term approach that he's taking, and so long as he's able to sort of take that path with maybe some slight deviances, he's okay with that. But for us, it's like every 4 years when there's a change in administration, there are, of course, leadership priorities, but there's this tendency to want to either undo or to completely correct whatever was done in the past. And that's the corrective measure, I think, is it's applaudable, but at the same time, we're not really keeping focus on the problem itself, and we're trying so hard to do something that's vastly different from the previous administration, when perhaps we should think about that, but if something in the past was tried and true, we should keep with it, and also think about things that we haven't done and see what we can incorporate that would either make the approach more robust or Kim is also used to a certain way of dealing with the United States, so he's also comfortable with that. And it's not to say that we should go all out and do something that's dramatically different from, the pursuit of diplomacy or sanctions. But we are still, I think, at times surprised by Kim's behavior, or we're slightly taken aback. I don't think Kim's seen that from us. So that's something that I think we also need to kind of keep in mind.
Right. Well, thanks. This was really a fascinating discussion. I don't think we often get a chance to dig sort of deep into this topic of sanctions, and so we really appreciate both of you joining us. And to our listeners and viewers, thank you again for joining us on the Impossible State podcast. We look forward to seeing you join us on future podcasts, as well as you can look at some of our old ones online. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you soon.